I think that I'm going to get started just sharing with everyone a very warm welcome. Thank you so much for being with us today. As many of you know, my name is Chitra Golestani, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar entitled How Bahá'í Teachings on Racial Unity Influenced My Academic Career by Dr. Richard Thomas. This webinar is going to be live streamed. Hopefully, we're keeping our fingers crossed on YouTube, and then later accessible on many platforms. So you'll be able to listen to it as a podcast. We hope you enjoy it and that you'll share it with others. As many of our viewers know, the Wilmette Institute is an online educational institution providing university and extension courses dedicated to the building of a new society through transformative education. Our interdisciplinary courses aim to develop the capacity of participants to contribute meaningfully to the current discourses of society, exploring both spiritual and material dimensions of our collective advancement. Our educational endeavors, including courses, certificate programs, webinars, inspire a commitment to social transformation, drawing upon a Baha'i conceptual framework in the areas of community building, social action, and contributing to prevalent discourses. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the Baha'i faith, please learn more at baha'i.org or baha'i.us. Just a few announcements before we get started. Looking ahead to April and May, we have two exciting extension courses. One is the Baha'i Faith and the Arts, starting April 23rd. This course explores the Baha'i perspective on the arts. If you appreciate the arts and their power to uplift and inspire, this course is for you. The second one is Becoming Protagonists for Social Change. This one starts on May 7th. This course is a part of the Wilmette Institute's Connecting for Change, a learning series designed especially for youth and young adults. Participants join weekly 90-minute Zoom sessions, engage in online discussions, and complete a community project applying their learning locally. Now, we are getting ready to start the webinar. During the presentation, you're invited to post questions in the Q&A section, some of which will be addressed at the end of the presentation. I should also mention that the views and opinions expressed in the Wilmette Institute webinars and academic programs are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views of the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of the United States. Now, I have to say that it is truly an honor and a privilege to introduce Dr. Richard Thomas, whose work I have admired for many, many years for various reasons, but I'm going to try to keep the introduction short so that we can get to the main webinar with him. As you know, this webinar will be on how Baha'i teachings on racial unity influenced my academic career by Dr. Thomas. Those of you familiar with him already know that he's a professor of history at Michigan University, where he taught courses on the Black urban experience, comparative Black history, and U.S. race relations. He has lectured internationally and authored several books, including Life for Us is What We Make It, Understanding Interracial Unity, and The Lights of the Spirit, that was co-edited. His work has earned multiple awards, including the Gustavus Myers Human Rights Award and the Wesley Logan Prize. His recent work includes Race Amity, America's Other Tradition, and Anchor of Faith. A founding member of the Baha'i Men's Gathering, Black Men's Gathering, he is featured in the Baha'i Faith and African American Studies book that was all co-edited. And you will have the authors in a minute, but Dr. Thomas has a chapter in there where he discusses basically the Baha'i faith and its influence on his work. This webinar is a conversation on that particular chapter, and we really look forward to having that exchange. But before we do, I wanted to just share a few of the images from a selection of his published books. As you will see, understanding interracial unity. Many of you are familiar with racial unity and imperative for social progress. Other ones include Lights of the Spirit, where Elsie Austin is featured in there as well. Anchor of Faith, Detroit, Race Amity, America's Other Tradition, and this final book, The Baha'i Faith and African American Studies, edited by Loni Bramson and Layli Maparyan. So we look forward to having this discussion on the chapter. Welcome, Dr. Thomas. Thank you so much for being with us today. It is.
Thank you for inviting me.
Oh my goodness. Well, I think that your beloved wife, June, must be tired of me because I've been at it for 2 years asking if we can bother you again after retirement to come and speak with us and share these truly important reflections that you have. So thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
I'd like to get started with the first question that is about your chapter 3 in this book that was mentioned, and that you start this chapter by sharing that you embraced the Baha'i faith in 1962. And later, after becoming a Baha'i, you were, an African-American student activist who admired Malcolm X, and you were involved in so many different groups. How did you come to learn about the Baha'i faith and embrace it?
Yes, this was quite a period in my life. This was the early 60s.
Mhm.
I had spent from 57 to 1960 in the Marine Corps. Sort of a week after I graduated from high school, I joined the Marine Corps. And then I returned home with an understanding of the nature of racism. I experienced a great deal of racism in the Marine Corps. When I returned home, I was also very interested in different kinds of religion because I served at Okinawa, where the religion was Buddhism. And when I came home, I started raising questions about why some people thought that their particular religion, particularly Christianity, was the most important religion. I ran into a white graduate student on the east side of Detroit who was telling me about this weird religion. And he in turn introduced me to Margaret Danner, who some of you all know was a very famous African-American Baha'i poet. And when I visited her, she shared some thoughts about this strange religion. I wasn't particularly interested at that time, but the more I thought about it, the more intrigued I became by this religion. Now, at the time, many African Americans of my generation were very much involved in the Black Power movement and Black radical movement. At one point, I was very involved in the Black Student Alliance movement. I was one of the founders in the mid 60s. And at the time that I was exploring the Baha'i faith, and trying to understand its teachings, I was also very much concerned about the state of the Black community. And so um, the more I became interested in the Baha'i faith, the more I began to realize that I had to figure out how to reconcile these two interests. I went to rallies. I heard Stokely Carmichael at Michigan State. I remember going and hearing Malcolm X. Many of us who were Baha'is at the time were very much swept up in these Black student movements, these Black radical movements. At the same time, we were very concerned about our Baha'i identity, and so you had those two tensions. This picture here in the late 60s is very interesting because it shows a group of African-American Baha'is who were invited by the National Spiritual Assembly to discuss their concerns. At the time, we didn't know, some of us knew each other. You can see Robert Henderson with the afro, and then you can also see leaning down with a suitcase. It's Glenford Mitchell, who was on the National Spiritual Assembly at the time. And in the background, you also see from the left, Farouz Kazimzadeh, who was a professor at Yale University. And so they invited us to the National Spiritual Assembly because they were concerned about our involvement in many of these movements. And so it was an opportunity for us to take some type of ownership, not only of our faith, but also to articulate our concern about the Black movement and racism in the United States.
Thank you so much. So for those who may not know why there would even be a difference of approach that the Baha'i community would have for civil rights versus like a radical movement, can you say a few words about that? What was the difference?
Well, I think what was happening in the Baha'i community at that time, and I mentioned this in the in the chapter, the Baha'i community was still learning how to deal with racism within its ranks, and when young Black Baha'is started raising the question of the most challenging issue. For example, one of the first books that I read as a young Baha'i in the early 60s was The Advent of Divine Justice. And my Baha'i teacher, an African-American, a woman, focused a great deal on what Shoghi Effendi had said about racial discrimination in the larger society as well as in the Baha'i community, and how to go about and resolve it, in resolving it. But at the same time, you had a well-meaning older generation of Baha'is, both Black and white, who could not quite understand why we were so concerned. And so you had that older generation of Baha'is articulating their views of racial unity, and then you also had young Black Baha'is and as well as some white Baha'is in the 1960s involved in these racial justice movements and Black power movements who were raising the issue of how we need to immediately work on these problems. And so that you had that creative tension going on within the Baha'i community and among African American Baha'is. All the reason why National, in its great wisdom, gathered a bunch of us together to talk about these issues and to really voice our concerns.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I would say that tension or maybe dichotomous thinking within society definitely still exists as far as demanding change now, wanting to see issues of social justice addressed now, versus a long-term approach of non-adversarial social change that takes time to change hearts and minds. So I don't know if you would agree that that tension definitely is still there in society.
Yes, yeah, the tension is still there, but there are creative ways over the decades. We have learned a wide range of ways of solving these problems. Uh, thanks, to the guidance that we have gotten from the Universal House of Justice. I think hopefully people have read this book this recent book by Paul Lample, In Pursuit of a More Superb Mission, exploring a framework for the elimination of racial prejudice in America. A wonderful, wonderful book. And as I was reading it, I was just thinking how blessed this generation of social activists and race unity advocates, how blessed they are to have this book to clarify some of the concerns that they have.
Truly, truly. And then that means we have no excuse to not press onward, right?
Yes, yes.
So over the decades, you taught race relations in universities, the Baha'i community, and beyond. In this chapter 3 of the book that we mentioned, you mentioned writing the book Understanding Interracial Unity, a study of U.S. race relations. And you reflected on how you taught students to prepare really for a lifelong engagement in a racially diverse global community. How did you go about doing that? What are some of the memories of education that was transformative? How was it that you saw some of your students as spiritual warriors, you mentioned in your writing?
When I think about it, when I became really interested in racial unity and participating in various Baha'i activities, I was also beginning my training as a historian.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the first jobs I got when I was a graduate student at University of Michigan was in the newly established Department of Racial and Ethnic Studies at Michigan State University. So I was a graduate student at University of Michigan, but I was also an instructor in this new department. But I was also a Baha'i. And at that time, I was really concerned about how to teach race relations. I had designed a course called Ethnocentrism and Racism as part of my work in the Department of Racial and Ethnic Studies. And among my first students were those who had been, Black and whites, but primarily white students who had been traumatized, as well as, other kinds of things that were happening in their lives. But they had been traumatized by the 1967 race, you can call it a race riot or rebellion or civil disorder. And so I had a cohort of young people coming into these new courses that I had developed in this department who needed some understanding of racism. So I was teaching the history of racism, but at the same time, as a Baha'i, I was trying to figure out how I could give them a certain vision that would commit them to social justice. And at the same time, how could I sort of share with them the Baha'i vision of racial unity? And later on, we can talk about how those two, created some tensions. And so among my first students, as I was reminded last year, was a colleague who reminded me. She said, Richard, she's now a professor. She said, Richard, 50 years ago, I was a teenager. This, this Baha'i was a teenager, and you were my professor. Later on, I would also teach with her, and we would, organize the Emerald Project and what have you. But as I was teaching these kids, I was thinking about how could I equip them with the skills and the visions to do something. It wasn't enough for me to teach a course on race relations, and then after the course was over, they would go back to their segregated
Right.
communities.
Mm-hmm.
And I kept thinking, as a Baha'i, I have to do more than just be a teacher of traditional race relations. And so we started, I started thinking about them as these spiritual warriors going back into their communities, you see, and building relationships.
Yes. And, we are building on that spirit and that work that you did, trying to um, do a similar thing with the social transformation program right now that the Wilmette Institute's working on. It's not easy
No,
to
no.
have pedagogy that's transformative. It's a whole different thing, actually. So yeah, I really admire that you gave that example of spiritual warriors in your book. You also have mentioned just generally that in your career you traveled internationally, helping racial justice advocates understand the principles of racial unity. How did you share your Baha'i-inspired teachings in other countries? I think you were in the United Kingdom in the 1980s, and of course, other countries that were experiencing racial conflict and so forth.
What was really a fascinating event in my life in the 80s was several things, but I was asked, I had written a lot about race riots and what have you in Detroit. And at the time, I was teaching a graduate course on race and poverty in urban areas.
Mm.
And I was invited by several scholars associated with the ethnic studies program at Warwick University in the UK. I was invited along with another professor from Harvard. He'll come to my mind in a minute. We both were involved in race relations, and they wanted me to give a talk related to the work that I had done in Detroit. Now, by that time, I started trying to not only talk about various ways to build racial unity in racially polarized societies, but I was also trying to make sure that in these interracial scholarly forums, that I could introduce a Baha'i-inspired concept. Because
Mhm.
here again, as a Baha'i, I could not just talk about racism, the history of racism. I had to do that as well as offer a broader vision. And
Mhm.
so
Mhm.
I was invited to Warwick. And so I decided that I would give a lecture on two major riots in American history, two of the worst urban disorder, racial urban disorder, one in 1943 and then the other in 1967, because those were the ones that I was most familiar with. And I decided to talk about how to promote or how people promoted racial unity in the wake of these riots. In other words, what did they do after these urban disorders had occurred? And very few people were doing this type of research. And so that was my contribution uh, in the UK in the in the 80s, even though in 1976, the Department of Racial and Ethnic Studies had sent me to Lakenheath Air Force Base to teach a graduate course on race relations. The other experience, interesting enough, when the book Racial Unity and Imperative for Social Progress, when that came out in '93, the National Spiritual Assembly of Australia invited me to do a book tour and to conduct workshops on race relations. And so I did a book tour throughout Australia and as well as Fiji. And then, of course, when we took 2002, when we took our undergrad students, you see a bunch of our students there who are doing great work out in the world as we speak. I taught a course in comparative race relations in South Africa. What you see there is the spiritual warriors that I was talking about, who were just you're so proud of them. And these were kids who had to learn how to talk about race amongst each other. There we were in South Africa, learning about race relations, visiting various sites. We visited the prison where, oh my God, what is it? Where Mandela was. And so that was quite an experience. But so those are the places where I visited, among others.
And you mentioned that when both within the U.S. and internationally, when you spoke and offered courses and so forth, you couldn't just do the academic, identifying the issues and giving a purely historical perspective. But when you did your Baha'i inspired work, you had to chart a way forward, a path forward, right? And to share some of the principles. Would you be so kind to share a little bit about how you balance that? And maybe for some of the listeners who aren't familiar with some of the Baha'i principles that you may have shared, what were they?
Yeah. Well, keep in mind that over the 40 years that I was teaching, there were all kinds of opportunities, sometimes unfortunate opportunities, where I had to balance the two. For example, in 1995, I was just getting ready to enjoy I think my second sabbatical. I was going to do some nice, comfortable research. Well, you all know what happened in 1995. You had the O.J. Simpson verdict. And the O.J. Simpson verdict reverberated. I mean, it impacted race relations throughout the country. I can recall in my department, people who had worked together, Black and white folk who had worked together for decades, began just sort of being, very upset with one another, trying to resolve these issues and what have you. And I felt as a Baha'i, now, of course, I was a professor, but I was motivated primarily, not by just being a professor teaching race relations, but by being a Baha'i, that I simply could not just stand back, go on sabbatical, write another book, you see. And so I decided to talk to some of my colleagues, since I was on sabbatical and didn't have any courses to teach at the time, if I could talk to their students. And so I went into these classrooms. I talked to the students about the state of race relations and pointed out how I knew that they were upset with the verdict, Black and white students, and that they had a role to play in resolving these issues. I didn't quite know how to do it at that time, but one of the professors said, if you all work with Dr. Thomas, you don't have to take the midterm. And so I got a couple of my grad students And we started working with these students in various small groups, talking about race relations. And then my colleague at the time, Jean Gazelle, and other folk, but particularly Jean Gazelle, and I decided that we were going to also go into the residence halls and get Black and white students to sit down with us and have, dinner and lunch and what have you. Because, there's been all kinds of research about how students segregate themselves by race in these university residential halls. And so we did that. And then after sharing a meal together, we would then go into a room in the basement and we would talk about race relations and what have you. And that led, to other developments. In fact, the most wonderful development was that the provost called me in for sort of a secret lunch because she had found out some of the work that we were doing, and I had known her since we were graduate students. And she offered a nice sum of money for us to start a project.
Wow.
And so Jean Gazelle and I, Jean being my first great, student, spiritual warrior, going back 50 years ago, we founded this organization, and just started talking to kids about race relations, organizing history courses that they could take about race relations, and then taking them on field trips to various places and what have you, teaching them, for example, how to just have pizzas together, go out and engage in other kinds of social activity, trying to give them the vision as well as practical tools of how to build these relationships.
I didn't know that you were going to be on sabbatical before that all happened. So
Yeah.
I know we're going to get there to get more deep into the development of that work. But before we do, you did mention the 1993 book, ABS book, Racial Unity and Imperative for Social Progress, where you developed the concept of the other tradition. What is the other tradition? How has that concept influenced how you teach race relations in the US, and what is its impact? That's
Okay, I guess we
one of
have
the
to.
question, because you know that I have part two for that question.
Yeah, I guess the first thing, the first step in answering that question is, how did my live interracial Baha'i experience impact how I thought about race as a professor? Because here again, I'm involved in a lot of Baha'i activities, interracial activities, and what have you. And I'm trying to figure out, how to write about these things. I didn't just want to write about the history of racism. I had done a lot of that, okay? And then at the same time, I was trying to reconcile what Shoghi Effendi had said about, in the advent of divine justice, how he talked about the due roles of blacks and whites, and I was struggling with how to reconcile that with some of the work that I was doing. One of the things that I was particularly concerned about was that as I taught the history of racism, was I helping students with that knowledge to be able to be change agents? Now, they could be advocates for racial justice and all of that, and that was important. But how could they also build creative, dynamic relationship in the context of that? And so I started thinking about, well, perhaps there's a history, along with the history of racism, of blacks and whites working together. You see, that perhaps, that has been an area in the history of race relations that simply had not been developed. And so I explored it, And when I started exploring it, uh, uh, I shared it with some of my students, some of my graduate students, and they kind of blew it apart. Come on, you being naive, Dr. Thomas, you see. But but I kept at it because I wanted to try to give students, along with a history of racism, a history of interracial cooperation, a history of interracial struggle for racial justice. I thought that they needed that. I
Mm,
discovered that whites needed to know that there were white heroes
mm,
throughout the history of America
yeah.
that played a very important role, and that blacks needed to understand. My black students needed to understand that they had always been white allies in their struggle.
Mhm,
Okay. Uh, and so that's how I started talking about the other tradition. Uh,
mm.
and I was happy to discover years later that some of my graduate students started talking about it in their master's theses and what have you.
Mhm. Even one author describing it as a new subfield in the racial and ethnic studies. I found that to be so interesting and so needed. But the thing about, even just seeing these images, of the history that you showed is um, speaks to when Baha'u'llah talks about our nobility.
Hmm.
When he says, "Noble, noble have I created thee." Um, we are all born noble. We all have a role to play in creating a new world, a new race of men that are united. And just knowing that history enables us to see where we are now and where we can, how we can move forward. So thank you for addressing that question before we move on to the Multiracial Unity Project that you started at Michigan State University. And for students and faculty development too, that's another area that is so critical, the role of faculty, not just students, right? Raising that capacity to inspire students to want to do this work. How did the multiracial unity living experience, EMRUL, as you call it, come about? I know you shared a little bit of that already. And what would you say you learned from the process? And how can we build at universities on this learning that has occurred?
Yeah, yeah. Well, just to back up just a little bit, uh, when we when I think about the multiracial unity project, it's kind of a funny story because I remember when we came up with the idea, we didn't have anything but a vacant room. I had my office, and I remember talking to my dean about the idea, and he was one of the longest serving deans at Michigan State, Joe Dowd. We had written several things together. Um, and I remember taking a piece of cardboard and putting it up on this the door of this room and calling it the Multiracial Unity Project, and then getting a signed frame saying a quote by Baha'u'llah, "So powerful is the light of unity that it can illuminate the whole world." And I had that nicely framed, and I put that, up on the wall in the hallway. But what we started doing as a result of that, since we were very concerned about all of the problems that were happening on campus, at one point when my uh, uh, my black students and my Jewish students were having problems in some of these discussions around the visit of Minister Farrakhan, we realized that we had to figure out how we could resolve those issues. Uh,
Mhm.
and so I got with a rabbi, and we taught a course on Black Jewish relations. At the same time, we were really given the opportunity to work with faculty when the provost asked us to start uh, holding workshops for new faculty. and to help them to understand how to teach in a multi-racial environment. And so we design classes, for those folk. But the key thing with Emerald was that, don't forget, the spark was that O.J. Simpson verdict that caused a great deal of racial, animosity and conflict within the university. And that's when Gene and I started, working with students. And I was lucky enough to have some great graduate students who helped us to conduct workshops and what have you. And it grew. This is Gene here on the, if you can see right there, and I'm somewhere in the back, and there are a couple of the graduate students. But we started working with them in the dorms, and named the project the Multiracial Unity Living Experience. And as I mentioned before, some of it was very difficult, because keep in mind, Black and white kids, as today, as well as kids from different other racial backgrounds, they had a lot of issues with how to go about resolving race. And so we had to put them in situations where they could discuss race relations and create a safe space. And I think that if Gene and I had not been Baha'is with decades of experience, live interracial experience that we could tap into, that would have been somewhat difficult. But we took them on field trips where in the process they learned how to interact with one another. We took them, a group of them, to South Africa. And when I think about it, that was about 30 years ago. Some of them are doing incredible work. Incredible work. And I mentioned in the book that I discovered that one of our students is now a professor, I think in Dublin. Yeah. And in her book, in the foreword, she talks about the project. And I had forgotten that she was a part of it. That was about 30 years ago.
That's amazing. Throughout your career, you taught interracial cooperation that was Baha'i inspired, and that emerged from your lived experience within the Baha'i community as a laboratory for learning. Yet you hadn't, taught a course on race and the American Baha'i community. So after 40 years of teaching at Michigan State University, you finally chose to teach the course, The Baha'is in the United States, The Growth of a Multicultural Religious Community, 1893 to 2006, as your final course of your career. Why did you culminate your career with this course?
I did not want to retire without making, I have been talking about the Baha'i faith in various venues for years. And so people knew I was, my colleagues knew I was Baha'i. My students knew that I was a Baha'i. I made it, maybe to a fault, I made it very clear whenever they would say, "Guys, we love your course and we love this approach to race relations," I made it very clear. This comes from my Baha'i experience. I'm a Baha'i, and these ideas about racial unity, these ideas about the other tradition, these are not my ideas. As a historian, I'm framing, of these ideas, with the Bahá'í Teachings. And so before I retired, I said, I've got to teach a course that will just focus on the Baha'i community as a multiracial community and how it evolved. and there were no Baha'is in this class. In fact, I think the class was predominantly white, but not mistaken. It was one of those special history seminars. But I just wanted to make that last commitment to my faith community. You see, because had it not been for my experience in the Baha'i community, and understanding and learning about various ways to bring people together, I would never have written those books. You see, I would have never focused on racial unity. I wouldn't have gone to conferences like at the University of Warwick in the UK and taken the chance to just talk about, racial unity in that context, if it had not been for the fact that I could think about and draw inspiration from 40 years, no, by that time, almost 50 years of being a Baha'i. And so, for example, when you look at this picture, this is a 1965. Okay, this is the Davidson Baha'i School. This was about 3 years after I had become a Baha'i. And this was one of the first interracial gatherings that I attended. This meant a lot to me. This really meant a lot to me. Davidson would have people from different racial and ethnic backgrounds attend their conferences. And don't forget, many of these people were from segregated Black and white communities. You see, many of these people lived in the white suburbs and the Black inner cities, but they could come together in places like Davidson, Michigan, build relationships that would then could be replicated, you see, in the larger community. And these gatherings meant a lot. They were laboratories where we learned to work together and to pray together and interact together and build relationships. And so that was in 1965. And then this one, and these are all sort of reflections of what I call my lived Baha'i interracial experience. And here you have delegates, and you can't help but look at these people, Rose Garden, the people from different racial and ethnic backgrounds. You can't help but look at this and just be really impressed, with the diversity in the crowd. And so that was just looking at that meant a lot. And here again is my, you can see my daughter holding the baby, you see. And this is my community in East Lansing, Michigan. My diverse community, my family. And so these are the lived experiences that I've had over the last 60 years. That really informed my view of race relations.
This might be an amazing moment to just pause back to some of the description you had given in the chapter of the Baha'i Faith and African American Studies, that chapter 3 that we talk about how the faith influenced your academic work. If someone were to ask, why do Baha'is prioritize racial unity above, like, let's say, class issues or gender issues, or why is it seminal in the Baha'i faith, and why was it that in your life?
But it goes back to the visit of Abdu'l-Baha, doesn't it, in 1912, where he talked about the importance of resolving racial conflict in America and the impact that it would have on world unity. You see, he said that many times. You see, it's a pivotal its reflection point, you see. And so Baha'is have been, and I tell people this all the time, we have been involved in trying to, for over 100 years or so, in trying to build a multiracial society, you see, because we know how important it is as a model for, for the rest of the world. America was perhaps the first multiracial society with the possibility of becoming a model for racial unity. When Abdu'l-Baha came in 1912, he emphasized that time and time again, and that's why Baha'is are so devoted to it. Now, what was the other part of your question?
Yeah, and then how, it became so important in your work and your life. Well, I understand because you embrace the faith. But you had also talked about some of the guardians' work
Mhm.
and making it so important both within the Baha'i community and your life. I wonder if you'd share a little bit more about, I think that you had mentioned just the writings in general, Pupil of the Eye and Most Vital and Challenging Issue, some of those concepts that really formed your work.
Yes, yes. Well, those of us who became Baha'is in the 60s, the turbulent, the 60s was, as you can imagine, was a very rough period of time, a lot of racial conflict and racial tensions and what have you. If many of us had not had those group of Black folk in that 1969 photo, if we had not had the guidance of the Guardian, and then later on, the Universal House of Justice, we would have gone off into all kinds of crazy directions. Because I can recall all kinds of radical movements that were trying to, to attract us. Um, uh, and we had a stream of guidance. We not only had the sacred writings of Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Baha, you see, and then the guidance of Shoghi Effendi. So I can recall in 1963, when the Universal House of Justice was elected, how excited we were. In 62, we were waiting. And then in 1963, the House of Justice was elected. And then in 64, the House of Justice encouraged a bunch of youth activities. I was a part of the first Baha'i Youth Project in the summer of 64 that went to the South. We got all that guidance, you see. And it was that guidance that kept informing me how to go about um, focusing my work on these issues from a Baha'i perspective. And I know some people didn't agree with me, but that was fine, because one of the things that I had that I think many of my colleagues didn't have is that I had a multiracial community. I had a laboratory. So if they could say, well, you're being naive, I said, well, I'm a part of a multiracial community that's been doing this for decades. Now, you might think that I'm wrong, but you can't deny the fact that the community exists. And even though we have struggles and what have you, we are working on building and refining, you see, these things.
We're struggling to build that society we want to see.
Yes,
Yes.
yes.
Yes, yes. In the question and answer, I know we have one more question that we want to get to, but there's a question here that's just so important, which is asking you to please share reflections on the transformative elements in the Black Men's Gathering and how it forged deep and enduring friendships and confidence in professional lives and service.
Oh Lord, that's a whole
That could
nother.
be its own webinar.
You all have to call, you got to call Dr. Billy Roberts and have, have them do that. But you know, when you stop to think, we just finished this book. Fred and I just finished the book Anchor of Faith.
Mhm.
It took us about 10 years to finally put it together. But I witnessed 25 years of a wide range, different kinds of African Americans with all kinds of issues and what have you. And I observed them uh, go through an incredible transformation. Um, um, in those meetings, we spent so much time studying the writings. They learned how to not only study the writings, but to internalize the writings and the guidance of the house into their personal lives. I watched that for 25 years. And when you think about the historical significance of this, you think about the history of the Baha'i faith in the United States, this is unparalleled. This is incredible. Uh, where you have this group of Black males going through this type of process. And they became members of local spiritual assemblies. They became auxiliary board members. Some of them became counselors. Uh, and I watched that process take place. And these were young men and older men as well, many of whom had been marginalized from the faith. I can recall the period when I was somewhat marginalized from the faith. My beautiful wife June had to go on pilgrimage and pay and pray for me.
Oh.
And so, uh, but the Black men's gathering was a gift to the community because the impact that it had on many people, rededicating many African American Baha'is uh, to service in the cause.
Mhm. Mhm. Yes, and there's another question. The Thurmans started the church for the Fellowship of All Peoples in San Francisco. They visited Gandhi and learned from him, of course, the nonviolent approach to racial justice that informed many African American theologians in their future endeavors. And then there was a question if you have any connection with the Thurmans still.
No, but oh Lord, do I love, uh, that I can remember it. I have his book somewhere in the house. I have his book, yeah, it's somewhere in the house. Uh, uh, and uh, and of course, June, my wife's father, uh, was a minister, and he was familiar with, with Thurman, and what have you. But oh yes, I think about the great work that he did, and I think I mentioned in one of the books, uh,
Mm,
his church as an example. In one of my books, I do mention Thurman. Yeah.
mhm. I think the race America's other tradition, I think.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Um, you mentioned the Universal House of Justice and the guidance that we have, and of course, the writings and so forth. And we've learned the Baha'i world all over, global community has gained experience with community building. That's
Mm.
called a framework for action, where people really work shoulder to shoulder to contribute to the advancement of their neighborhoods and communities. What are your thoughts on this approach to building multiracial communities? Do you feel that it's direct enough? Do you, um, have experience with it? Please share your thoughts about that.
I hope everybody gets this book by
Yes.
Paul Lample. This is this is a fascinating guide for where we need to go. And if you don't mind, there's a quote in here from the Universal House of Justice. Can I read it?
Please.
The-
Yes.
Where it says, it's from the December 19th, 2020 letter. On the issue of racial prejudice and its practical impact as described in your letter, the House of Justice feels that Baha'is can best learn to respond to the problem of racial prejudice through the daily effort to apply the teachings of Baha'u'llah in their personal lives, as well as through their involvement in community building activities, social action, and the discourses of society. You are therefore encouraged to strive to promote meaningful relationships among people of all races in your community and seek to enrich the conversations in whatever social spaces you participate by drawing on perspectives from the Bahá'í teachings and the experience of the Bahá'í community. Undoubtedly, as the Bahá'í community grows, its capacity to address such issues will correspondingly increase. This is so inspirational. And in terms of those spaces, June and I, along with our neighbors, some years ago, we in a condo where many of the people had been living for 25 years. They never interacted. They didn't know one another. Well, we put a couple of tables in the driveway and brought some food. And now we have people coming, you see, when the weather is nice, you see every month or so, and they just, an interracial group of folk. And we just sit around and talk and just enjoy ourselves. Those are the social spaces that we can create. And then, like folk and Baha'is and all over the country, we have these meaningful conversations. We have them every Friday. And when I look around the group, we've got these people, multiracial folk, sitting around in these spaces, building relationships. And so that's the most important thing, you see.
And we know that the world basically revolves around relationships.
Yes, yes.
Abdul Baha talks about the power of love being what the world, runs on. So
Yes.
if we want lasting transformation, that heart-to-heart connection has to be there, which leads to another question here in the Q&A. Teaching cultural perspectives and historical truths is being outlawed. How should we respond in practice? I know you just answered it, but if you have any other
I
things
think
you wanted
about,
to add.
what this reminds me of? This reminds me of the resistance, quite not like today, that we Black students and women students and other students of color ran into in the 60s. I can recall being a part of a group of students trying to get the history department to teach, Black history. And I can also, recall just the work that we had to do to do these things. And so I think the most important thing is for us to continue to do these things, to create these spaces. You see, Baha'is, I think, will introduce the whole concept of constructive resilience at this time in terms of how to deal with these issues. We'll come up with all kinds of creative ways. We will create all kinds of spaces where we can see these initiatives. And so, I'm not at all discouraged. I work with a group of inner city kids. I call them my spiritual warriors too. We put out a book called Spiritual Warriors 1, and just a couple of, I'll have to send you a copy. And
Please
we put out a
do.
book called Spiritual Warriors too. These are a bunch of little, But anyway, um, that's the challenge. So these developments that are taking place, uh, they don't worry me. I'm reading Tehezadeh, I'm rereading Tehezadeh's book about the revelation of Baha'u'llah. And I think about the history of the struggle of the Babis and the Baha'is. I think about as Baha'is, we've got a long history of struggling to build these spaces. And so to me, it's just, it's just a challenge that we're going to meet.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And if we don't have challenges, then how can we be pushed to the next level of growth?
That's right. That's right.
Mm-hmm.
You see.
There are so many questions. Of course, I can keep you here all day, and I know that I promised that we would try to keep it to 1 hour. But I could say that already in the Q&A, people have written and thanked. One person said that she ordered Pursuit of a Superb Mission and will deepen on it. So we know that that's all of our homework to
Absolutely.
deeply study it together.
Yes. Yes.
And I really cannot thank you enough for spending the time, and your dear wife, dear Dr. June Thomas, for helping with gathering some pictures and whatnot. We so appreciate all of the wisdom and the example that you've set for us. Whether we're in academe or not, that we are all spiritual warriors
Yeah.
for racial unity. And if we see ourselves as anything less than that, then we've really missed this superb mission that our writings have given us.
Yes.
Yeah, to be the promoters of racial unity. So
Well,
thank you so
Chitra,
much.
I am so, you are just an angel. You pulled this old man out of retirement and I even put on a tie and I found, and I just did it for you in the program.
Well, I have been bugging you for years. I remember when you spoke at like the Phoenix conference in Arizona, and then there was a time at ABS, I think in the early like 2000s, where I came to you, walking up to you, I said, I don't see a lot of like African American people here. Why is that? And then you said, all right, I think we need to sit down. I need to explain a little bit more. But yeah, really, it has been such a gift to be in your orb. So
Oh, thank
thank
you
you
so
so
much. Thank you so much. Well,
and I hope we continue. Oh no, here comes more Q&A. All right, let me just make sure that we're not leaving anything. Everybody is thanking you so much for all of your insights.
oh, bless them,
And
bless.
we hope to have you again sometime,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I promise to be respectful, and not ask too much. But
And hopefully they'll get this book. Tell all those folks in the Q&A, don't ask that old man for any questions. Get this book.
I'm sorry, I don't think we could deliver on that. You have way too much experience that brings all of it to light. So thank you for sharing that experience. And thank you everyone who took the time to be with us today. So have a wonderful rest of your weekend. Thank you, Dr. Thomas.
Thank you. Thank you.